Yeah, I think, and just, even from my perspective, I can throw in a little bit about the solution build aspect, right, which is what, I specialize in. So, coming from the project management side, project management 101 on IT projects is when it falls behind schedule, cut the reports, right?
And training's next.
Yeah, right, training's part two. But yeah, you can't do that anymore in a data-driven mindset, right? And especially when you're trying to create a system where there is value in the data as an asset inside of the system. So it has two impacts, and it's in early phases of the project. In the analysis phase, you're not ignoring the reports, you're focusing your analysis around the reports, right? That's working with those departments and divisions that are stakeholders in the system and saying, let's look at these spreadsheets and look at all the sources and access databases and things that you're doing to get to this. Let's work from this and figure out how the system actually needs to be designed and architected in order to get to that outcome, right? That's a big difference from, the past where it was more sort of, let's look at the workflow, let's look at, the process of, what somebody does to key data enter in, right? So looking up front at what the outcomes are is a big piece of that in the analysis phase. The second piece is in the design phase, so more on the technology side, the data modeling, right? Again, the data model was constructed more around transaction processing, right? And that's important, but now there's also a mindset of, hang on, let's make sure we don't lock ourselves into something that is not, conducive to either being able to share that data out or being able to produce value, from that data either in its current form or through a tool. So there are things that you can look for even today in, any system implementations that you might have going on in very early phases to make sure that you're approaching it correctly such that it's conducive and ready for that different mindset. So on that point, talking about mindset, right? And all of the panelists touched on this, right? There's this, don't touch my data, right? How do we get them to open their arms and share the data? How do you get to that mindset of making this our data?
So, like any change in your organization, you can either offer a carrot or a stick, right? And the stick rarely works, right? Thou shalt do this or else, but what's the else, right? So really it's the carrot, and I think one of the first things you should offer to the business in your organization is, try to remind them of what they're going to get in return, right? Part of the reason of them putting their data in is so they get someone else's data back out, right? So maybe they'll be able to look at something in a new light they haven't been before because they have a broader data set to look at. But this comes up a lot when I go around the state and talk about BI. I'm often asked, why do BI projects fail or sputter along? And part of it is this, it's the my data. And so, I think there are two reasons for fear. One is you're gonna find data quality problems. When you dig in and you start getting better analytics, you're gonna notice right away there's something wrong with this data, right? And so people are fearful the finger's gonna come back and point at them. So in any BI project or analytics, you have to be very upfront, and everyone has to know there's going to be problems, and you just have to decide what you're going to do with it. Are you going to go back and fix it at the source, or are you going to fix it at report time and just audit, why it differs from the source? But yeah, so if departments get wrapped around on the data quality and why are there problems, and we've been making decisions on bad data, and that's true, but that was the past. How are you going to move forward? I think the other is, people do put a lot of work into these systems and they really do feel like it's their data. So, one of the other approaches is to remind them that more often than not, you just want a copy of the data. Mm-hmm. We're not going to go into the source system and change it. And so it sort of gives them some relief, I think, that you're not going to go in and actually, be changing values. But yeah, it's what are you going to get in return? And if you give us your data, we're going to give you someone else's data. And I think that works more often than not.
And I think the big picture is it's all about the consumer journey. When we go from my data to our data, it is actually providing better services to the younger citizens who expect a lot more from their government.
Yeah.
Why do I have to fill this form 8 times to get this service? It's because my data is 8 siloed systems. So if everybody thinks about the consumer journey and how we can provide better services, and we go from my data to our data, I think we improve services for everybody in the state.
Well, and I think that's a good point, right? I mean, none of us as a citizen are touched by one organization in the state. We're touched by multiple organizations, and there's a lot of interdependencies that go on here. And you want as complete a view of me as a citizen to deliver that better service. And that data does not necessarily sit in one department or in one agency or in one work group. It's across the spectrum of the organization. And so, and what's inevitably going to happen today is that someone's going to ask, if you have my data, someone's going to ask you a question that's going to go beyond your data. And you're going to have to figure out a way of getting that answer. Or you say, no, I can't give it to you, and then you may well have decreased your value to that individual in providing relevant information for them to do their job. And so you've got to be, and that may be a carrot, could be a stick too, right? To say, I don't want to be a lot of stupid, but nonetheless, I mean, that's where you see this coming in. I mean, the silos are just not working today in modern analytics and this explosion of just a variety of data. It just doesn't work. And citizen expectations, to CJ's point, are driving a lot of that forward.
Cool, all right. Well, let me go ahead and switch gears here and talk a little bit about tools and techniques. And I'm going to kick this right off with a shot across the bow. So, the data warehouse is dead. May she rest in peace. CJ, agree or disagree?
That's a pretty bold statement. I wouldn't say data warehouse is dead. I think it's evolving at a much faster pace. I could see some use cases if your agency or department's pretty small, then you don't probably need to invest in a big expensive data warehouse system. You can probably still stay with the more modern BI lean and nimble systems. So I think in that case, yeah, I could say that the data warehouse is dying. It's not dead yet. So
It's on life support.
but I think if you have a big enterprise where you are generating data every second and you need data from a historical perspective and also need to use that data to do some future forecasting. So I think it really depends on each organization, how big your budget is and how big your data sets are. Even looking at the newer technologies, we build a data warehouse when we want to speed up the data aggregation process. The whole idea of having, let's say, OLAP Cube is so you don't have to wait for your SQL query in the morning to do, let's say from Pepsi, how many cans of soda I sold this morning. That query will take a long time to add up every single line item to give you the sum of sales done for the day. But now with the modern tools we have, the speed is so fast that you don't need to have a OLAP cube to aggregate all that data. You can pretty much do instantaneously with the modern BI tools. So I think that kind of, and the modern BI tools are much more intuitive as well for business users. They're not as IT heavy platform. So I think that's one of the big changes that I see is having a big, moving from a more IT-oriented data warehouse deployment, the whole strategic shift is happening towards more nimble, lean, modern BI systems.
Yeah, I think that the big data warehouse is dead, and it's I think it's on its way out. But I think you also have to look at mission critical organizations and who are going to need some sort of they're going to need data stored in a certain area, and that may be where we see this evolve. But CJ's right. I mean, I think modern analytics today, I mean, you can blend all different sorts of data sources. I mean, PDFs and anything that you need to get that almost instantaneous view of it, and so it doesn't require storing all this information.
I think the other thing is the warehouse is not the only source of analytics anymore. So even if your warehouse stays the same, there are other pieces in your landscape. I mean, looking around the room, I've talked to more than one of you about a data lake because you're interested in doing analytics as soon as the data comes in and maybe trying to get trends. I think as hardware and memory and storage have gotten cheaper and we can just do full data replication and not have to depend on an extract process so much to whittle the data down. I think with replication, we're able to do, analytics a little more immediately. So yeah, I think the warehouse is still part of it, but there are other pieces in the landscape now.
Great, all right. So moving down into some of the more, theoretical and cooler, newer things, right? So let's talk a little bit about AI and machine learning. So Chris, I mean, what do you see as far as that technology, real or imagined, making its way into public sector?
Well, I think, again, it's not as far off as it sounds. Going back to one of my earlier statements about we're in the period of moving from being reactive to proactive. Part of that is predictive analytics and trying to predict outcomes and anticipate them and tool accordingly or scale up before they happen. So I think we're going to see machine learning very soon, and I think social services is already doing this, but imagine getting a constituent who's applying for a service and they stop halfway through the process. Based on what they filled out so far and the history of other people who have applied, you can predict whether they're actually going to come back and complete the application later. Or if I'm getting service 1 from you, what's the likelihood that 6 months from now I'm going to come back and ask for service 2? Maybe we should just go ahead and do eligibility determination up front. I think the other area we're going to see this is on the fraud side. So for one, if I have businesses who are helping, administer public programs, and I've had bad actors in the past, through machine learning, I can, feed in their activities. And when I get a new business or vendor apply today, I can predict, the chance of, is this going to be potential fraud down the road? And then I think the last side, but still in security, is facing this internally. Your own staff, I mean, we've talked about, terabytes of data, and I have clients now talking about, I have petabytes of storage need coming up. There's a lot of data and a lot of people have access to it. So the other way is going to be applying this internally, of looking at people's pattern of poking around the network and figuring out who's not following a normal usage pattern for their job. So that's another one for machine learning.
Yep. So, related to that, and we touched upon this briefly, but I didn't want to, skip over the topic for you, Rob, but that kind of, big data not being so big anymore, right? You discussed part of it with respect to just the sheer ability of the tools, but, anything you wanted to kind of add to that?
Well, I think like everything, we get used to it. I mean, there's a lot of data that's being generated now. I mean, if you look at the numbers, it's huge, right? And so big data is not as overwhelming now for everybody, and data's everywhere. And yes, it's moving at velocity. I mean, there's huge amounts of data created every day. It's not all consistent, so there's all the veracity and the velocity and all of that. But so we see it. It's just pervasive, right? I mean, it's just what we do now as governments and private organizations. We generate a lot of information, a lot of data, and the expectation is that we're going to analyze a lot of that. What we have to start to determine is what's good data and what's bad data. Some data is just not going to be. It's not going to matter, right? It's not going to tell us anything. So what do we really care? Let's throw that out. So I think we're getting used to it, and it's ingrained in how we do our jobs today. It's just anybody who does their job uses data. I am not by any means a data scientist, but I use Tableau every day to understand where I am with my budget, where I am with certain programs I'm running, and that's constantly refreshed for me. It spins every 5 seconds, and so it's not so big for me anymore. It's just data. It's just data.
And I think one of the other point is data was big when we did not have the compute power.
Right.
So if you look back a few years ago, we had the chip maker limitations. You're running a 32-bit or 32-core Intel or AMD chip, crunching this terabytes of data. But now, as data is growing 40% year over year, in the last 9 years, Intel and AMD is only growing 20%. It's a TikTok. So there's the compute power was always lagging behind than the volume of data that we are producing every second. So now the companies are thinking it from a different perspective. They actually are using graphics or video cards that we use to play video games with to crunch all that data. So now NVIDIA is coming up with these GPUs, or Google came up with this TensorFlow unit, which is actually a application-specific piece of hardware that you can throw billions of rows of data and it can crunch in milliseconds. So the whole ETL process, moving the data from one system to another OLTP system to the OLAP system, and regardless of what your data volume is, I think once you throw the data at this new hardware and software combined, the compute power is exponentially better than what it was 2 years ago. So I think that makes the data not so big anymore, because you actually have the compute power that can handle terabytes of data in real milliseconds.
Yeah. So we got a little less than 10 minutes. Kind of just one final, question to the panel as a whole. CJ kind of started the thread there with the notion that through things like this GPU-based computing power, through some of these newer products on the market. I mean, these are innovations that are not pie in the sky. They're real and they're accessible, to a government agency. So, open question to the panel: any other thoughts or insights around where and how a government agency can embrace some of these bleeding edge trends?
Well, I think CJ hit on a good one. I mean, but to me, the larger question is, should the government be bleeding edge? And so as a taxpayer, my first instinct is always no, right? And been building systems a long time, you want something that's tried and true, that is going to work. But I think this is one area where, you guys can be, because the risk is pretty minimal. You own the data, and that's not going to change. And a lot of these tools we're talking about aren't a large investment, because, again, compute power is just getting cheaper and cheaper. I can spin up something in a public or private or a hybrid cloud and send some data up there through machine learning, and then spin it down, and I've spent $32 or whatever. So I think government has avoided bleeding edge because of the potential risk and the cost, but I think this is one area where both those things are fairly low.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the cost of compute, if you get a IBM or a HP appliance with NVIDIA or any other major vendor that has these graphics cards, you can literally, a $80,000 machine has 100 times more compute power than one of those engineered systems that we all got from the big vendors. In-memory appliance, we all heard about, very popular systems from one of the big players in the industry. So I think from a public sector perspective, the technology is a commodity now. So if you get 100 times more compute power for a fraction of the price you pay for an engineered system, I would say, why not? It's the perfect time to leapfrog and jump from a mainframe to a high-performance compute appliance. I see it's a no-brainer.
Yeah, I think not adopting the bleeding edge leaves you behind. I think, especially in data analytics, because I don't think there's as much of a bleeding edge now. I think it's just very established, and so, you're going to have to become a data-driven. We're all going to have to become data-driven, and so that has to happen. And both my colleagues are right. The risk is down, and so is the cost. It's now is the time to do it.
Great. Well, thank you guys very much. So we've got about 5 minutes left. I want to kind of open the floor up now for any questions from the audience. Anybody with a burning question that you might want to ask the panel? Okay. Please, let me bring up Michael.
So I'm always worried when I'm trying to come up with ideas. I'm an auditor, and trying to get other businesses to maybe jump in with regards to saying, we're going to take this feature away, because I really would like to do my own analytics, because I always get told by IT, it's going to take a week before I can do that. And then when I look at their query, because I'll say, can I see your query? And it'll show something that I didn't ask for. When you talk about taking that kind of responsibility, I'm assuming, I'm talking to Covered California because it's another state agency, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm assuming you did that. So how did your IT people kind of react to taking that power, that task away from them? Because you use Tableau?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
We use Tableau and other modern BI products as well. So we did not take away the tools. What we did was because I have a small IT team, and we could not fulfill the requirements of everybody in the organization. So we deployed Tableau Desktop to everybody in program areas. So because as an analyst, your job is to focus on the data and find fraud. But sometimes people see that getting the data quality and the ETL process, data integration, was a big task. So what IT team is now responsible in my division, we make data available. We publish the data extracts on Tableau server as a curated data set. And we give the entire data set to the user. So we're democratizing data so people can do self-service analytics.
So it's
And-
a copy of it.
Yeah, and we are out of the business of authoring reports for the business, so we're just saying data to the people, more power to you. If you know around best practices or how to create a dashboard or build a report, we can work with you. And we actually publish data, give it back to the users, and let them explore, or maybe they can find answers they never thought about or
So in
possible.
this case, IT sold the idea to the business people.
Yeah.
Okay. I was hoping you were going to say it the other way around, and I could use that as somewhat of a model, because I can see IT people going, wait a minute, we do that, don't take my job away from me, so, but you know what? You're still
No,
a
there is
model.
job security for everybody, so IT is responsible for bringing the data together and then giving it back to the business so
Okay.
they can do their own analytics.
I say that only because I've ran into that,
Yeah.
as far as wanting to run my own reports, and
I mean, we see those challenges, every,
I
yeah.
want to be respectful, I just thought if there's a model, I can say, what?
But I think to CJ's point, and one of the things we hit on earlier, demand is up. IT can't keep up. And so, and then, back to my sort of data steward comment, you know the data better than IT anyway. So, yeah, I don't see as much resistance. IT totally understands their utility in this. They make sure the water's running, but yeah, it's going to be up to you to do it.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the question. And unfortunately, we are out of time, so I apologize that we didn't get to more of a Q&A. But contact information for our panel is up there. Please feel free to reach out to one or all of them with any follow-up questions or comments. More than happy to hear your feedback. And again, thank you all for your time this afternoon. Really appreciate you taking the time out to talk with us today. Thank you.